am innocent, but nobody wants to listen to me. I have been sitting here for days trying to tell the truth, but it seems like nobody cares anymore.
Somebody will come save you. Then the weeks pass, then the years. Eventually you stop looking at the calendar because hope becomes too painful to carry. Every morning begins the same way. Steel doors slam shut. Guards yell down cold hallways. Another inmate disappears into the system. Another life fades quietly behind concrete walls. But for Ethan Cole, the hardest part was never the prison itself. It was knowing that somewhere beyond those walls were people who understood he should never have been there in the first place. Imagine losing 20 years of your life for a crime you never committed. Imagine watching your parents grow old through scratched prison glass. Imagine missing birthdays, funerals, holidays, and the ordinary moments most people take for granted because 12 strangers in a courtroom believed a story that was never fully true. And now, imagine discovering that the evidence which could have saved your life had been sitting untouched in a storage box for nearly 2 decades while prosecutors fought to keep it hidden from the public. That is exactly what happened to Ethan Cole. For years, America believed Ethan was a killer. News stations called him a monster. Newspapers printed his face beside terrifying headlines. Politicians used the case as proof that the justice system worked. But the deeper this story goes, the more disturbing it becomes because Ethan Cole's conviction was built on weak eyewitness accounts, manipulated timelines, and a theory investigators refused to let go of even after cracks began appearing everywhere. What happened to him would eventually expose failures inside one of the most trusted institutions in the country. It would destroy careers, reopen old wounds, and force people to confront a terrifying possibility. If the system could do this to one innocent man, how many others were trapped in cells across America, begging for somebody to finally listen? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story begins in the late summer of 1998 in a quiet Virginia town called Blackwater Ridge, a place where people rarely locked their doors and everyone believed they knew their neighbors. It was the kind of town where high school football games filled entire parking lots on Friday nights and where local diners still served coffee to the same customers every morning before sunrise. Families had lived there for generations. Children rode bicycles down empty streets without fear. But everything changed on the night 24-year-old Rebecca Lawson disappeared. Rebecca was well known throughout the community. She worked as a waitress at a roadside restaurant just outside town and had plans to attend nursing school the following year. Friends described her as ambitious, warm-hearted, and deeply protective of her younger sister. On the evening of September 18th, Rebecca finished her shift around 10:30 p.m. and told co-workers she was heading home. She never arrived. When Rebecca's abandoned car was discovered the next morning near an old industrial lot outside town, panic spread rapidly through Blackwater Ridge. Search parties formed immediately. Volunteers walked through wooded areas carrying flashlights, while local churches organized prayer meetings for the Lawson family. 3 days later, Rebecca's body was found near the riverbank several miles from where her vehicle had been abandoned. The crime scene horrified even experienced investigators. News coverage exploded overnight. Reporters crowded outside police stations demanding updates, while national media outlets picked up the story within days. Pressure on law enforcement became overwhelming. The town wanted answers immediately, and police promised they would find the person responsible no matter how long it took. At first, detectives had almost nothing. There were no cameras near the area, no confirmed eyewitnesses to the attack, no murder weapon. What investigators did recover, however, were several biological samples collected from Rebecca's clothing and beneath her fingernails. At the time, DNA testing existed, but the process was expensive, time-consuming, and far less advanced than what we know today. Detectives feared waiting months for forensic confirmation would make the department appear weak and ineffective during one of the most publicized murder investigations the town had ever seen. That was when Ethan Cole entered the investigation. Ethan was 28 years old, worked construction jobs around Blackwater Ridge, and occasionally stopped by the same roadside restaurant where Rebecca worked. He had no violent criminal history and was generally described as quiet, reserved, and hardworking. But according to investigators, one witness claimed they saw a man resembling Ethan near Rebecca's car late that night. Another witness later stated they remembered Ethan acting nervous during the days after the murder. Those details alone should never have been enough to build a murder case, but once detectives focused on Ethan, every ordinary action suddenly became suspicious in their eyes. His inconsistent recollection of exact times during police interviews was treated as deception rather than confusion. The fact that he knew the victim casually became evidence of obsession. Detectives slowly built an entire theory around him, and from that moment forward, they stopped seriously considering anyone else. What makes Ethan Cole's story so disturbing is that this was never just about one man sitting alone in a prison cell claiming he was innocent. America has heard those claims thousands of times before. Every prison in the country is filled with inmates insisting the system got it wrong. But Ethan's case carried details investigators could never fully explain away. The evidence against him always felt incomplete. Important timelines never matched perfectly. Witness statements shifted over time. And buried deep inside the original case files was forensic material that prosecutors avoided discussing whenever possible. For years, defense attorneys kept asking the same question. If the state was truly certain Ethan Cole committed the murder of Rebecca Lawson, then why were officials so determined to prevent newer DNA testing from taking place? Why resist science if the truth was already clear? The question would haunt courtrooms for nearly 2 decades because every time Ethan's legal team pushed for access to the evidence, they were met with resistance, delays, and arguments that made less sense as the years passed. Some prosecutors claimed the evidence may have been contaminated. Others insisted reopening the case would re-traumatize Rebecca Lawson's family. But privately, even some investigators involved in the original case began expressing doubts about the conviction. One retired detective would later admit that pressure from the public pushed the department into narrowing their focus too quickly. Once Ethan Cole became the face of the investigation, nobody wanted to admit they may have chosen the wrong suspect. As the years went on, rumors quietly spread among legal circles throughout Virginia. People began questioning whether Ethan's conviction was the result of simple incompetence or something far more troubling. Because hidden inside storage lockers and courthouse archives were records showing alternative leads had existed early in the investigation, leads detectives never fully pursued after arresting Ethan. There were unidentified fingerprints recovered near Rebecca Lawson's vehicle. There were reports of another man seen near the industrial lot the same night Rebecca disappeared. There were inconsistencies in witness descriptions that never reached the jury during trial. Yet somehow none of those details stopped prosecutors from seeking a life sentence against Ethan Cole. And that raises a frightening possibility. Once the justice system publicly declares somebody guilty, reversing that narrative becomes incredibly difficult even when evidence starts pointing in another direction. Careers become attached to convictions. Reputations depend on appearing correct. Entire departments fear embarrassment, lawsuits, and public outrage if mistakes are exposed. So instead of reopening old questions, many institutions choose the safer path. They protect the verdict at all costs. But in Ethan Cole's case, the deeper attorneys looked into the original investigation, the more unsettling the story became. Because this case was no longer only about whether an innocent man went to prison. It was becoming a story about how far powerful people might go to avoid admitting they were wrong. Long before courtrooms, prison walls, and newspaper headlines turned Ethan Cole into one of the most controversial names in Virginia. He was simply a hardworking man trying to build a normal life in Blackwater Ridge. He grew up in a small blue-collar neighborhood on the edge of town where everybody knew each other's families and front porches stayed crowded during warm summer evenings. His father, Thomas Cole, worked long shifts as a mechanic at a local trucking company, while his mother, Margaret, cleaned rooms at a roadside motel just outside the county line. Money was always tight inside the Cole household, but people who knew the family often described them as honest and deeply connected to their community. Ethan was the middle child of 3 brothers and rarely caused trouble growing up. Teachers remembered him as quiet and reserved, the kind of student who kept to himself but always showed respect. He was never the loudest person in the room, never the center of attention. Friends later said Ethan had a habit of listening more than speaking, often avoiding arguments even when others tried provoking him. By his late 20s, Ethan spent most of his days working construction jobs across Virginia alongside his older brother Caleb. The work was exhausting, especially during the summer heat, but Ethan took pride in earning an honest paycheck. He dreamed of eventually starting his own small home repair business one day and talked often about buying property outside town where he could settle down and raise a family. People close to him remember a man who enjoyed simple routines. Friday night cookouts with friends, Sunday dinners with his parents, watching old football games while repairing engines behind his brother's garage. He had dated several women over the years, but was never known for reckless behavior or violence. Even Rebecca Lawson's friends later admitted Ethan had never made them uncomfortable during the few times they saw him at the roadside restaurant where she worked. In fact, many people who knew Ethan struggled to understand how investigators transformed him into the image of a brutal killer so quickly. That confusion would only grow stronger as more details about the case slowly emerged. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Ethan Cole's story is how ordinary his life truly was before everything collapsed. There were no warning signs pointing toward disaster, no violent outbursts, no hidden criminal lifestyle. Just a man trying to survive paycheck to paycheck in a town that suddenly turned against him almost overnight. Looking back now, people often revisit old memories, searching for clues they somehow missed. They wonder if there was a moment when Ethan realized his life was slipping beyond his control. Maybe it happened the first time detectives brought him in for questioning. Maybe it happened when local news stations began airing his photograph beside Rebecca Lawson's name. Or maybe it happened later, sitting alone in a courtroom while strangers discussed him as if they already knew exactly who he was. What nobody understood then was that within months, Ethan Cole would lose nearly everything he cared about: his freedom, his reputation, his future. And once the justice system labeled him guilty, escaping that label would become almost impossible, no matter how loudly he insisted the police had arrested the wrong man. On the evening of September 18th, 1998, Blackwater Ridge looked completely ordinary. Families were finishing dinner. Teenagers gathered outside convenience stores. Football games played across television screens inside crowded bars and living rooms. Nothing about that Friday night suggested the town was only hours away from becoming the center of one of the most controversial murder investigations in Virginia history. Rebecca Lawson finished her shift at the roadside restaurant shortly after 10:30 p.m. Coworkers later recalled she seemed tired but cheerful. She joked with another waitress about plans for the weekend, collected her tips, and walked into the parking lot carrying a small denim jacket over her shoulder. It was raining lightly that night, just enough to leave the streets wet beneath the glow of traffic lights. According to witnesses, Rebecca climbed into her car and drove away alone. That was the last confirmed moment anyone could say with certainty that she was alive. When Rebecca failed to answer calls the next morning, her younger sister Emily became concerned almost immediately. Rebecca was known for checking in with family regularly, especially after late shifts. By noon, panic had already started spreading through the Lawson household. Friends drove around town searching for her vehicle, while local police began treating the disappearance seriously due to the unusual circumstances. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Around 2:15 p.m., a passing truck driver spotted Rebecca's abandoned car near an industrial area outside Blackwater Ridge, close to the riverfront warehouses. The driver later described the scene as unsettling from the moment he pulled over. One of the doors was partially open. Rebecca's purse remained inside the vehicle. Her keys were missing. Police arrived within minutes and immediately sealed off the area. Rain continued falling while officers searched nearby lots using flashlights and patrol dogs. Hours later, investigators found signs of a struggle several yards away from the vehicle. 3 days after Rebecca vanished, search teams discovered her body near a muddy riverbank hidden behind thick brush. News of the murder spread across Virginia almost instantly. The investigation exploded under intense public pressure. Reporters flooded Blackwater Ridge, while television crews broadcast live updates from outside police headquarters day and night. Residents grew terrified. Parents stopped letting children walk alone after dark. Local businesses closed earlier than usual. Rumors traveled through town faster than facts. Some believed Rebecca had been targeted by a stranger passing through town. Others feared someone local committed the crime. Detectives worked around the clock, following every lead they could find, but the deeper they looked, the more complicated the timeline became. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts about Rebecca's final hours. One person claimed they saw her arguing with a man near a gas station shortly before midnight. Another insisted they spotted Rebecca's car driving toward the industrial district alone. None of the statements fully aligned. There was also very little physical evidence directly connecting anyone to the crime scene. Investigators recovered biological samples and partial fingerprints, but early forensic testing failed to produce immediate answers. Still, pressure on law enforcement kept growing with each passing day. The public demanded an arrest, and officials feared appearing powerless during one of the most horrifying crimes Blackwater Ridge had ever seen. Then suddenly, detectives shifted their attention toward Ethan Cole. According to investigators, a witness placed him near the area around the same time Rebecca disappeared. That single detail would soon alter the course of his entire life. But what detectives failed to mention publicly was that another witness had also reported seeing an unidentified man near Rebecca's abandoned vehicle that same night, a detail investigators quietly pushed aside as their focus on Ethan Cole intensified. Once Ethan Cole became the center of the investigation, the entire direction of the case changed almost overnight. Detectives no longer searched for the person who killed Rebecca Lawson. Instead, they began searching for anything that could make Ethan appear guilty. It started quietly at first. Officers interviewed his co-workers repeatedly, asking whether Ethan had ever shown signs of aggression or unusual behavior. Friends who barely remembered casual conversations suddenly found themselves pressured to reinterpret old memories in a darker way. One former co-worker later admitted investigators kept insisting Ethan fit the profile long before they had any solid forensic evidence connecting him to the crime. And in high-pressure murder investigations, once police decide they have their suspect, every unanswered question often begins bending toward that conclusion, whether the facts support it or not. The interrogation of Ethan Cole lasted nearly 14 hours, spread across 2 exhausting sessions inside a small room at the Blackwater Ridge Police Department. Detectives told him they already knew he was responsible for Rebecca Lawson's murder and claimed witnesses had placed him directly at the scene. Ethan denied involvement from the beginning, but investigators kept repeating the same accusations hour after hour. They suggested he blacked out after drinking. They implied he may have attacked Rebecca during a moment of rage. He simply could not remember clearly. Psychological pressure became their primary strategy. According to later court reviews, detectives frequently interrupted Ethan whenever he tried explaining inconsistencies in the timeline that could have helped his defense. Instead of investigating alternative suspects, they focused entirely on forcing Ethan into contradictions. By the end of the interrogation, he appeared exhausted, emotionally drained, and confused about exact times and details from that night. Prosecutors would later use that confusion against him in court, presenting his uncertainty as proof of guilt rather than the result of relentless questioning. At the same time, local media transformed Ethan Cole into the face of fear inside Blackwater Ridge. News broadcasts replayed his photograph beside dramatic headlines for weeks. Commentators described him as a dangerous predator before any trial had even begun. Rumors spread rapidly throughout town. Some claimed Ethan had secretly stalked Rebecca Lawson for months, despite no evidence supporting that theory. Others insisted police possessed hidden forensic proof they were refusing to reveal publicly. The pressure surrounding the case became so intense that many residents assumed Ethan was guilty long before prosecutors ever stepped into a courtroom. And that public perception mattered because once jurors entered trial, they were not hearing the story of an ordinary construction worker presumed innocent under the law. They were hearing the story of a man already portrayed across television screens as a killer. The most disturbing part is how weak the actual prosecution narrative remained beneath all the emotion and media attention. There was still no murder weapon linking Ethan to Rebecca Lawson's death, no fingerprint match, no DNA confirmation placing him at the crime scene. Witness statements continued conflicting with each other, and timelines shifted repeatedly depending on who investigators interviewed. Yet prosecutors kept building their theory around assumptions instead of facts. They argued Ethan had opportunity. They claimed his behavior during questioning showed signs of deception, but opportunity is not proof, and nervousness inside an interrogation room does not make someone a murderer. Ethan repeated the same words over and over throughout the investigation, during interviews, and later inside the courtroom itself. "I didn't do this." Even years later, former jurors admitted those words stayed with them long after the trial ended, because despite everything prosecutors claimed, there were moments when Ethan Cole sounded less like a criminal trying to escape punishment, and more like a terrified man watching his entire life collapse while nobody around him was willing to listen. By the time Ethan Cole's trial began in the spring of 2000, most people in Blackwater Ridge already believed they knew exactly who he was. Months of relentless media coverage had turned the courtroom into something closer to a public spectacle than a search for truth. Every morning reporters lined the courthouse steps waiting for updates, while Rebecca Lawson's grieving family sat quietly inside the front rows, carrying photographs of the young woman they lost. The atmosphere inside the courtroom felt emotionally charged from the very beginning. Prosecutors understood they did not just need to present evidence. They needed to tell a story powerful enough to erase every doubt lingering around the investigation. And that is exactly what they tried to do. The state painted Ethan Cole as a violent man hiding behind an ordinary appearance. Prosecutors described Rebecca Lawson's murder in painful detail, forcing jurors to relive the brutality of the crime hour after hour. They repeatedly emphasized the emotional suffering of Rebecca's family and argued that Ethan's inconsistent statements during police questioning revealed a guilty conscience. But underneath the dramatic language and emotional testimony, major holes remained in the case. There was no DNA linking Ethan to the crime scene. None. The biological samples recovered from Rebecca Lawson's clothing had not been matched to him. There was no murder weapon connecting him to the attack, no surveillance footage, no confession, no eyewitness who actually saw Ethan harm Rebecca. Even some courtroom observers later admitted the prosecution's case relied more on creating suspicion than proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Yet in emotionally charged trials, fear can become more persuasive than facts. Ethan's defense team struggled from the beginning. Unlike prosecutors backed by state resources and investigators, his attorneys had limited funding, limited forensic support, and very little ability to challenge the growing public narrative surrounding the case. Important forensic experts were never called to testify. Several witness inconsistencies were not fully explored in front of the jury. And perhaps most damaging of all, the defense failed to aggressively challenge the interrogation tactics detectives used against Ethan during those exhausting 14-hour questioning sessions. Prosecutors repeatedly played edited portions of the recordings showing Ethan appearing nervous and uncertain. Jurors watched him stumble over timelines and struggle to remember details from months earlier, while detectives pressured him relentlessly. To many people inside that courtroom, exhaustion began looking like guilt. Then came the moment that changed Ethan Cole's life forever. After only 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with a verdict. Ethan sat frozen beside his attorneys, while Rebecca Lawson's family held hands quietly across the room. According to reporters present that day, the courtroom became so silent that people could hear papers moving as the foreperson stood to speak. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of aggravated assault. Guilty on all major counts. Several members of Rebecca's family broke down in tears, believing justice had finally been served. Prosecutors lowered their heads with relief after months of public pressure. And standing in the center of that courtroom, Ethan Cole looked completely stunned as deputies moved toward him with handcuffs. Moments before officers escorted him away, he turned toward the jury and repeated the same sentence he had been saying since the beginning of the investigation. "I didn't kill her." "You're making a mistake." But by then, nobody wanted to hear it anymore. The town believed the nightmare was over. The case appeared closed. Yet the most shocking part of Ethan Cole's story had not even begun, because hidden inside police evidence storage were forensic secrets that would eventually threaten to destroy the entire conviction years later. The first year inside prison nearly destroyed Ethan Cole. Like many newly convicted inmates serving life sentences, he entered the system believing the nightmare would eventually correct itself. He convinced himself the appeals process would expose the mistakes made during his trial. He believed somebody somewhere would finally look closely at the evidence and realize the case against him never truly made sense. But prison has a way of crushing optimism slowly and quietly. Days became routines measured by head counts, steel doors, cafeteria lines, and the constant awareness that freedom existed somewhere far beyond concrete walls and razor wire. Every morning, Ethan woke up to the same cold ceiling above his bunk, knowing another day of his life had disappeared inside a place he never should have been. And as the months turned into years, something even more painful began happening outside those prison walls. Life moved on without him. Birthdays passed one after another, while Ethan sat inside crowded visiting rooms, watching his family age through thick security glass. His younger brother Caleb got married. Friends moved away from Blackwater Ridge. Children he once played basketball with grew into adults with families of their own. Holidays became especially difficult because prison magnifies loneliness in ways few people can imagine. According to letters later shared by Ethan's legal team, he often wrote about how strange it felt hearing other inmates celebrate parole dates, while he struggled to understand how an innocent man could disappear into the system so completely. The emotional weight became heavier after every failed appeal. Courts repeatedly rejected requests for retrials, arguing there was no significant new evidence strong enough to overturn the conviction. Judges trusted the original jury verdict despite the unanswered questions surrounding the case. Each denial chipped away at Ethan's hope a little more. Still, he never stopped insisting he was innocent. But the deepest wound came in 2008 when Ethan received news that his mother, Margaret Cole, had died after suffering a stroke. She had spent years defending her son publicly, while much of Blackwater Ridge viewed the Cole family with suspicion and shame. According to relatives, Margaret never missed an opportunity to tell people Ethan was innocent, no matter how many others doubted him. Ethan requested permission to attend her funeral under supervision, but the request was denied due to prison policy surrounding violent offenders. Instead, he learned about his mother's burial days later, while sitting alone in a prison visitation room staring at a folded letter from his brother. Former inmates who later spoke with reporters said Ethan barely spoke for weeks afterward. Losing his mother while trapped behind bars broke something inside him, because she had been one of the few people who never stopped believing he would someday come home. As the years passed, prison transformed Ethan physically and emotionally. His hair began turning gray before he reached 50, deep lines formed around his eyes, relationships faded, some old friends stopped writing entirely. Even people who believed in his innocence slowly accepted the possibility that Ethan Cole might spend the rest of his life inside prison walls. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all. The system did not just punish him physically. It slowly erased him from the world outside. By 2015, nearly 17 years after Rebecca Lawson's murder, Ethan's case had become little more than a forgotten headline buried deep inside courthouse archives. Most people assumed the story ended with the guilty verdict back in 2000, but hidden inside an agging evidence locker were biological samples investigators collected from the original crime scene decades earlier. Samples that newer technology could finally examine in ways impossible during Ethan's trial. And soon, science would begin uncovering truths the justice system had spent years trying to avoid. By the mid-2010s, advancements in forensic science were transforming criminal investigations across America. Cases once considered impossible to solve were suddenly being reopened through modern DNA testing. Men who had spent decades inside prison were walking free after science exposed wrongful convictions hidden beneath old police files and courtroom transcripts. Organizations dedicated to overturning questionable convictions began reviewing forgotten cases nationwide, searching for inmates whose trials took place before modern forensic methods became widely available. That was when Ethan Cole's name resurfaced. Nearly 17 years after Rebecca Lawson's murder, a small legal team connected to a wrongful conviction organization started examining the details surrounding his case. At first, they expected another difficult appeal with little chance of success. But the deeper they looked into the trial records, interrogation transcripts, and forensic reports, the more alarmed they became. Important biological evidence collected from Rebecca Lawson's clothing had never been fully tested using modern DNA technology. Even more troubling, portions of the original forensic material still existed inside evidence storage despite prosecutors previously implying some samples were either unusable or too degraded for further analysis. Ethan's attorneys immediately filed motions requesting access to the remaining evidence for advanced DNA testing. What happened next shocked even experienced legal experts. Prosecutors fought aggressively against the request. They argued the evidence chain may have been compromised over time. They claimed reopening the case would place unnecessary emotional strain on Rebecca Lawson's surviving family members. Some officials even insisted the original conviction remained valid regardless of what new testing might reveal. To many observers, those arguments raised a disturbing question. Why oppose scientific testing if the evidence would only confirm Ethan Cole's guilt? Why spend years defending a conviction while simultaneously resisting the one process capable of removing all doubt permanently? Inside courtrooms across Virginia, the legal battle became increasingly tense. Ethan's lawyers argued the state had a moral obligation to pursue truth no matter how much time had passed. Prosecutors responded by warning judges against rewriting settled convictions. But beneath the legal language and courtroom debates, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, people inside the justice system were beginning to fear that Ethan Cole might actually be innocent. The fight over DNA testing dragged on for months. Hearings were delayed repeatedly while attorneys argued over technical procedures, evidence handling, and forensic protocols. Meanwhile, Ethan remained inside prison waiting for answers that could determine whether he would die behind bars or finally reclaim his freedom. Former inmates later recalled how Ethan tried hiding his emotions during that period because he feared hopping too much after years of disappointment. But privately, he admitted this felt different from every failed appeal before it. This time, science stood at the center of the case instead of unreliable witness statements or emotional courtroom narratives. This time, evidence could speak for itself. Finally, in early 2018, a judge approved limited DNA testing on several preserved samples collected during the original investigation. The evidence was transferred under strict supervision to an advanced forensic laboratory outside Virginia. What happened next unfolded like a countdown no one could stop. Weeks passed while analysts examined biological material untouched since 1998. Attorneys on both sides waited anxiously for updates. Rebecca Lawson's family feared reopening painful wounds they believed had already healed years earlier. And inside a prison cell, nearly 20 years after his conviction, Ethan Cole waited for a single phone call that could either destroy the last hope he had left or expose one of the most devastating failures the Blackwater Ridge justice system had ever seen. In March of 2018, nearly 20 years after Rebecca Lawson was murdered, the DNA results finally arrived. Inside a forensic laboratory hundreds of miles away from Blackwater Ridge, analysts completed the examination of biological evidence collected from the original crime scene back in 1998. For Ethan Cole, the wait had felt endless. Every passing day inside prison carried the weight of a possible life sentence hanging over what remained of his future. By then, he was no longer the young construction worker jurors saw during trial nearly 2 decades earlier. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair, deep lines across his face, and memories shaped almost entirely by prison walls. Yet despite everything the system had taken from him, Ethan never stopped insisting the evidence would eventually prove he was telling the truth. When attorneys received the forensic report, the impact was immediate. The DNA recovered from Rebecca Lawson's clothing and beneath her fingernails did not match Ethan Cole, not partially, not remotely. The biological evidence pointed completely away from the man who had spent nearly 20 years locked inside a prison cell for murder. For a brief moment, even experienced lawyers struggled to process the magnitude of what they were reading. Because this was no longer a theory about investigative mistakes or concerns over unreliable witness testimony. Science had now destroyed the foundation of the entire conviction. The evidence prosecutors once avoided discussing had become the very thing exposing how catastrophically wrong the case against Ethan Cole truly was. But the story became even more shocking moments later. The DNA profile recovered from the crime scene did not remain unidentified. It matched another man already listed inside national criminal databases due to violent offenses committed years after Rebecca Lawson's murder. And when investigators reviewed old police files, they discovered something deeply disturbing. That same individual had actually appeared during the original investigation as a possible lead, but was never fully pursued once detectives shifted their attention toward Ethan Cole. Reports connected him to the area near the industrial lot the night Rebecca disappeared. Witnesses had mentioned seeing a man matching his description near Rebecca's abandoned vehicle. Yet those leads quietly disappeared as the case against Ethan gained momentum. For nearly 2 decades, the real killer had remained free, while an innocent man lost everything behind bars. The reaction inside Virginia's legal system was immediate and explosive. Prosecutors who once defended Ethan Cole's conviction suddenly faced enormous public scrutiny. News stations across the country reopened coverage of the case. Former jurors admitted they felt betrayed after learning crucial forensic uncertainties were never fully explained during trial. Rebecca Lawson's family experienced another devastating emotional collapse after realizing the man they believed responsible for her death may never have committed the crime at all. And inside a prison processing room in April 2018, Ethan Cole stood silently as correctional officers removed the handcuffs he had worn for nearly 20 years. According to witnesses present that day, Ethan barely spoke as prison gates finally opened behind him. Freedom no longer felt exciting. It felt unfamiliar. The outside world had changed completely, while his life remained frozen inside a conviction built on fear, pressure, and a desperate need for somebody to blame. After nearly 2 decades of being called a murderer, Ethan Cole walked out of prison an innocent man. But the damage done to his life could never truly be erased. Ethan Cole eventually got his freedom back, but freedom and justice are not always the same thing. By the time he walked out of prison in 2018, nearly 20 years of his life had already disappeared behind concrete walls. His mother was gone, relationships had faded, entire chapters of his life had been erased by a conviction that never should have happened. And perhaps the most painful truth of all was that no court ruling, financial settlement, or public apology could ever return the years stolen from him. People often imagine exoneration as a happy ending, but for many wrongfully convicted individuals, freedom comes with emotional scars that never fully heal. Ethan had to learn how to live in a world that moved forward without him. Technology changed. Society changed. Even Blackwater Ridge itself looked different from the town he remembered before Rebecca Lawson's murder turned his life upside down. What happened to Ethan Cole forced many Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about the justice system itself. Organizations dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions have uncovered hundreds of cases where innocent people spent years or even decades inside prison before DNA evidence finally proved the truth. In many of those cases, the same patterns appear repeatedly: mistaken eyewitness testimony, tunnel vision investigations, prosecutors protecting convictions instead of pursuing facts, interrogations designed to pressure suspects into confusion and fear. Once a person becomes the center of a major investigation, proving innocence can become nearly impossible even when evidence begins pointing somewhere else. Ethan's story was never only about one wrongful conviction. It became part of a much larger national conversation about how easily fear, pressure, and public demand for quick justice can destroy innocent lives. And that leaves one final question hanging over this entire story long after the courtroom lights faded and prison gates finally opened for Ethan Cole. If modern DNA testing had never reopened Rebecca Lawson's case, Ethan would likely have died in prison, still labeled a murderer by the state of Virginia. That means the truth survived only because science advanced far enough to expose what people failed to see nearly 2 decades earlier. But how many others are still waiting for that chance tonight? How many innocent men and women remain trapped inside prison cells while evidence sits forgotten in storage boxes somewhere across America? And perhaps the most frightening question of all is this: if the system could get it this wrong once, how many more stories like Ethan Cole's still remain hidden from the public even now? Today, Ethan Cole lives as a free man, but freedom arrived carrying memories that will follow him for the rest of his life. Nearly 20 years were taken from him because investigators focused on winning a case instead of fully pursuing the truth. Rebecca Lawson's family suffered through unimaginable grief, believing the wrong man had been held responsible for her murder, while the actual killer remained free for years. And the people trusted to protect justice became part of a system that almost buried the truth permanently beneath paperwork, courtroom victories, and public pressure. Cases like this leave behind questions with no easy answers because even after exoneration, the damage continues long after prison doors finally open. Some people still believe the original conviction happened because of honest mistakes made during a difficult investigation. Others believe certain officials ignored warning signs because admitting failure would have destroyed careers and reputations. But regardless of where people stand, one reality cannot be denied. Ethan Cole lost nearly 2 decades of his life for a crime science proved he never committed. And that forces us to confront a difficult question. Was justice truly served in the end, or did the system fail long before the DNA results finally exposed the truth? Because prison did not only punish Ethan Cole, it punished his family, his future, and every moment he should have spent building a life outside those walls. Meanwhile, the real killer continued living freely, while investigators defended the wrong conviction year after year. Stories like this challenge the very foundation of trust people place in the justice system. If prosecutors fight against testing evidence capable of revealing the truth, what does that say about the system itself? Should officials face consequences when wrongful convictions destroy innocent lives? And if you were sitting on that jury back in 2000, hearing the same emotional arguments and incomplete evidence, would you have reached a different verdict? Ethan Cole's story is disturbing because it reminds us how fragile justice can become when fear, pressure, and public opinion overpower facts. The truth survived in this case because evidence remained hidden long enough for science to eventually uncover it, but countless other inmates may never get that opportunity. Somewhere tonight, another prisoner may be staring at a steel ceiling, repeating the same words Ethan Cole said for 20 years. You got the wrong person. The terrifying part is that sometimes they may be telling the truth. If this story shocked you, subscribe to our YouTube channel now, because the next case we uncover may be even more unbelievable. And before you go, tell us what you think in the comments below. Should prosecutors be punished when innocent people lose decades behind bars? Would you still trust the justice system after hearing Ethan Cole's story? Because in the end, one lesson remains impossible to ignore. The truth may stay buried for years, but evidence has a way of speaking eventually. And when it finally does, entire lives can change forever.